Hello, everyone. This will be a reading of this reading, authoring ethnicized subjects, Rigoberta Menchú, and the performative production of the subaltern self by Arturo Arias. This is a 16-page long reading, probably 12 pages if we take out the beginning and the notes. Let's begin. So by now, you've hopefully already read and looked at understanding what the subaltern is, looking at this, and then also of the making of Rigoberta Menchú, Testimonio and Self-Fashioning by Alice Britton, and this is this text, the next one. The question is certainly not mine. Can the subaltern speak? However, right, he's referencing Spivak here. However, the case of Rigoberta Menchú and the recent attacks on the factuality of her mediated discourse in the Testimonio ad Rigoberta Menchú force us to reconsider it. Gayarty Spivak's seminal question presupposes that a subaltern subject whose voice has been recorded in print is no longer a subaltern subject because the speaking subject must enunciate the language of reason to be heard by Western interlocutors. That is, authentic discourse is suppressed or hidden truth because of the Westerner's inability to comprehend it in its own terms. Thus, subaltern subjects are forced to use the discourse of the colonizer to express their subjectivity. And subjectivity here is talking about personhood, and it's a bit difficult philosophically, but you can interpret it as saying person for now, right? So subaltern people, to express subjectivity here is talking about how they see the world, right? To express their experience of being people. This essay attempts to extract from the debate surrounding Menchú's text a meaningful contribution to current thinking about the issues regarding the status that the ethnicized subjects and testimonio, a subaltern textuality, have in academic circles in the United States. By ethnicized subjects, so here we are defining our terms, thank you. I mean individuals who identify themselves with a group or community that considers itself and is regarded by others as culturally distinct from other more powerful groups inhabiting the same national space. So ethnicized subjects, specific kind of person, right? That is having ethnicity put upon them by society, right? Individuals who identify themselves with a group that considers itself a group as such, and that as by others in that national space, national community, are identified as being culturally distinct. The contradictions that derive from the subaltern's positionality have created, so there's contradictions that happen because of where the subaltern is, have created the conundrum in which Menchú is trapped. In a recent book, Rigoberta Menchú and the Story of All Poor Guatemalans. So this is the Stoll book we've been talking about, right? The one that the article Tarnished Laureate is basically summarizing, not redoing, but summarizing the main points of. This is Stoll's book, that's its title. David Stoll finds her, on the one hand, not Western enough when it comes to the rigor of her logic and the use of her facts. He thus accuses her of invention, of fibbing. On the other hand, he finds her too Western in her politics, and therefore claims that her ideas are not representative of what he judges to be authentic native Mayan thought. She's not native enough to represent all native Guatemalans, but at the same time, she's not enough like the West because her logic and her use of facts isn't up to the standards of the West. Central to this contradiction is the nature of discourse. Discourse. Authenticity and truth, if they exist at all, resist comprehension, expression, and definition. What is more, even the most strategically planned elocution may elude the speaker's intentions because of the polysemy of language. I don't know what that means. Let's look at that. That means, that words have coexisting different meanings. When someone tries to reduce the multiple meanings of discourse and ignores the slippages inherent in translation, in this case from Quiché to Spanish to English, the polemics generated seem inevitable. So polemics is sort of another word for the controversies, more specific to kind of discourse, especially Latin America. But we can talk about it as controversy and discourse. The testimony of Rigoberta Menchú, a Mayan woman from Guatemala, was an important instrument in a discursive war tied to Cold War politics. The debate has centered on whether Menchú told the truth in her book. This issue opens up the problematics of truth, the nature of testimonio as a genre, and the relation between political solidarity and the subaltern narrative. All of those things together, look at that. We can only expect an absolute truth if we believe in perfectly verifiable truths, or if we still see or insist on saying authentic indigenous subjects, people, as noble savages whose alleged primitiveness puts them closer to some imagined natural truth. I think we've seen this term enough. Oops, not that. We've seen this term enough that we should look it up as a term. So let's see. A noble savage is a literary stock character who embodies the concept of the indigene, outsider, wild human, any other who has not been corrupted by civilization, and therefore symbolizes humanity's innate goodness. Savage at that time could mean wild beast as well as wild man. Besides appearing in many works of fiction and philosophy, the stereotype has also heavily employed in early anthropological works. It is colonizer shit, basically. I won't read the rest, but it is, I think if we look at, it's very offensive, it's very reductive, but it was very foundational to setting up a lot of the ideas of colonialism, the ideas of how we look at Native people, the concepts we have, the stereotypes we have, this sort of like romantic primitivism, which is just another way to dehumanize, all of these things. I'm not reading all of them. I'm trying to see if there's any bit that will explain what I'm trying to say here. But see how often it's used, right? In all of this history. Yep, here we go. In 1960, John Crawford and James Hunt linked the noble savage concept with developing schools of thought regarding scientific racism. Crawford, in alliance with Hunt, was elected, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Invoking science and realism, the two men derided their philanthropic predecessors as believing in human equality and for not recognizing that mankind was divided into superior and inferior races. So racist shit, basically. Yeah. But that is an idea that is so entrenched in how anthropologists see indigenous people that you have to contend with it. It still is everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. On seeing authentic indigenous subjects as noble savages whose alleged primitiveness puts them closer to some imagined natural truth. According to these criteria, indigenous persons who use discourse strategically either lose authenticity or are being manipulated by external forces. Right? So from this idea that has been foundational to Western thought, especially when it has to do with colonial relations with Native people, you get this idea that indigenous persons who use discourse strategically either lose authenticity and are no longer quote unquote real natives, or they're being manipulated by external forces. Therefore, they must be seen as de facto pawns and mimics of Western colonizers or of the colonizers' revolutionary opponents. And again, talking about this in the context of the Cold War, right? Proxy wars, finding your ways through proxy people. This is the argument that David Stoll makes in his book, which sparked controversy surrounding the 1992 Nobel Peace Prize recipient. In constructing an argument about Menchú's inauthenticity, Stoll finds discrepancies between her account and interviews he conducts with other Mayans. He claims that Menchú's inaccuracies suggest that she is a spokesperson not for the Maya people, but rather for the radical revolutionary left in the form of the Guerrilla Army of the Poor, EGP. For those ends, she distorted Mayan truth. For whose ends she distorted Mayan truth, right? This is his summary of Stoll's arguments in his book. Thus, although Stoll begins with a seemingly neutral or objective concern, a recurring question is whom to believe. How do we weigh the reliability of Rigoberta's account against the versions I collected and documented sources? He quickly demonstrates an ideological bias. I hope to convince readers that the EGP never developed the strong social base in Uspantan that Rigoberta would have us believe. This sentence rhetorically links Manchu to the EGP, implying that she was a propagandist for the organization. Ironically, this maneuver also reveals the strategic manipulation of information in Stoll's own account. It may even cause us to question whether we can define fact in the Guatemalan context, where disseminating information often leads to torture and death. This also raises a question about the role of truth in testimonio, right? The genre. This will be hopefully useful to you guys in doing the final versions of your testimonio when you talk about the genre itself, right? Use some of these words, maybe some of these quotes, some of these definitions to define testimonio in your papers. The function of testimonio. Theoretical attention to testimonio grew at the end of the 1980s. George Gugelberger refers to the genre as a desire called third world literature, adding that testimonio became the center of polemics and canon debates. John Beverly claims that what is of interest in a testimonial is its quote-unquote truth effect. Testimony does not produce or reflect exact historical data, he explains. Rather, it questions the privileging of literature as an institution, at the same time that it becomes a new literary genre of the subaltern sector of society. Thus, testimonio does not produce or reproduce reality, but like that which, in the Lacanian sense, resists absolute symbolization, it produces a sensation of experiencing reality. So this is talking about some philosophy, some theories about how language and how thinking works. But the important bit is, testimonio does not produce or reproduce reality. It produces a sensation of experiencing reality, right? Part of that is identifying with the narrator, which we read in that other paper on self-creation or self-construction. Testimonio was never meant to be an autobiography or a sworn testimony in the juridical sense, like in the court sense. Rather, it is a collective, communal account of a person's life. This is what Manchu implies when she says, "This is my testimony. I didn't learn it from a book, and I didn't learn it alone. My personal experience is the reality of a whole people." The testimonio of the 1980s also implied the logic of collective political action. A testimonio was assumed to exercise a formative influence and thus play a pedagogical role analogous to that of slave narratives in the United States before and during the Civil War. This role was necessarily contingent, since it exceeded the symbolic dimensions from which it originated, marked by violence and conflict. Inasmuch as the genre was developed as a means of empowering subaltern subjects and hearing their voices, one can hardly be surprised that it was a tool for political agency. The recent debate surrounding the truthfulness of Manchu's testimony, Elzbieta Skoldowska explains, is oddly out of place in an era that has redirected its critical energy from investigating the truth to the study of inventing, making, creating, or constructing. After all, she claims recent studies across a broad range of disciplines in the humanities and social sciences focus on the constructed or invented nature of such notions as ethnicity, sexuality, nationality, and gender. If these concepts fit the category of created objects, it is logical to assume that Manchu's testimonial narrative, too, should be approached with a self-conscious acknowledgement of its artifactual nature. So artifactual means it is an artifact, right? It was created. Although no one has denied that Manchu's text is an appeal for international support to stop the genocide of her people, few critics have paid attention to the ways in which testimonio is understood by its reading publics. The real issue in the present debate revolves more around these problematics than around the notion of testimonio as a genre or the political inability of Westerners to grasp a subaltern testimonio. By virtue of its hybridity, testimonio has invented different and conflicting readings from literary critics, anthropologists, oral historians, philosophers, and political scientists. This interdisciplinarity makes it clear that the interpretation of testimonio is contingent on the reader's ideological purpose and disciplinary focus. So you cannot read this genre that has a specific context point, and purpose the same way in different areas of knowledge, right? Interdisciplinary, so different disciplines interpret testimonial based on who they are as readers, right? And their purpose and disciplinary training and focus. As Sklodowska indicates, the lesson to be drawn from the current whirlwind of declarations about Menchu's book may be that it is an open text that can be read according to different parameters. Rigoberta Menchu's Testimonio as Political Discourse on Ethnicity. A significant percentage of indigenous Mayas, which included the Menchu family and their community, fought in the late 1970s against the oppressive rightist military dictatorship in Guatemala as allies of the left, albeit with their own agenda for ethnic empowerment and cultural signification. It is estimated that approximately 150,000 Mayas out of a population of 5 million were massacred or were disappeared during the peak of the conflict from 1978 to 84. And the Guatemalan army admits raising at least 450 villages. Proyecto Interdiocesano de Recuperación de la Memoria. That's the citation. It means it's like a truth and reconciliation thing. It's like trying to figure out recovering the project, the inter-regional project to recover memory. Very vague translation there, but that's where it comes from. So this were the estimates. The international visibility of this massacre before the publication of Menchu's Testimonio prevented the opposition government from garnering public support abroad. Arturo Taracena, a noted Guatemalan scholar and the representative of the Guatemalan opposition in exile in France during the early 1980s, helped organize the visit that first brought Menchu to that country, in an effort to raise awareness of the oppression in Guatemala. After Menchu arrived in Paris, Taracena conceived the idea of recording her life story as a way of furthering solidarity work on the European continent. It was he who introduced Menchu to Elizabeth Burgos de Bre and arranged for a week of interviews. These interviews resulted in the book, I, Rigoberta Menchu. In her testimonio, Menchu speaks of her people's pain and their modes of resistance to Ladino oppression. She mixes this with the struggle for land, Mayan rituals of birth, marriage, and death, the exploitative nature of plantation work, the death of her 2 siblings from malnutrition and pesticides, her migration to the city, her experience of racism while she worked as a maid, the radicalization of many Mayas as the result of experiences similar to hers, the creation of self-defense organizations, their destruction by the army, the subsequent death and torture of most of their members, including Menchu's parents and brothers, and her survival through flight from the country. In I, Rigoberta Menchu, one must acknowledge the force of the writing, its metaphoricity, so all the metaphors it has, and its rhetorical devices as a productive matrix that circumscribes, so that talks and sort of gives a context and defines a thing, the social engagement of the Mayan subjects, Mayan people, and makes the struggle available to others as an objective of and for action. Menchu's visibility at the end of 1981 did not extend beyond circles close to Guatemalan opposition and to its solidarity groups in Mexico. They saw her as a daughter of the Mayan grassroots activist who was a martyr of the burning of the Spanish embassy and whose name has become emblematic of that misadventure. I don't know why I called it the misadventure, but when they burnt down the Spanish embassy. She was a member of the Committee for Peasant Unity and worked on its behalf in Mexico City. However, the nature of exile implied that political work done outside the country had to focus on international solidarity or diplomacy. This was particularly true of a disempowered peoples who continued to be framed by a Cold War mentality, according to which any leftism represented a potential threat to the United States. Menchu's background is Mayan and Catholic, and her text is therefore interstitial. This word means of forming or occupying interstices. And so what is this word, interstices? A space. So in between many small spaces. She often talks about traditional Mayan religion to underline her ethnic roots, while also painting a social scene of the communalist unity among Mayans along Catholic lines, as Duncan Earle points out. She does not nuance the complexity of Mayan society in her text, limiting herself to using Maya's tradition and experiences of racism and oppression to justify their claims to human rights protection. Even in this singular displacement, we can see the absence of a simplistic binarism in her enunciation. So in what she says, she's not being very binary. Let us look at an example. I remember that when we grew up, our parents talked to us about having children. That's the time parents dedicate themselves to the child. In my case, because I was a girl, my parents told me, you're a young woman and a woman has to be a mother. They said I was beginning my life as a woman and I would want many things that I couldn't have. They tried to tell me that whatever my ambitions, I had no way of achieving them. That's how life is. They explained what life is like among our people for a young person. And they said that I shouldn't wait too long before getting married. I had to think for myself, learn to be independent, not rely on my parents, and learn many things which would be useful to me in my life. They gave me the freedom to do what I wanted with my life as long as, first and foremost, I obeyed the laws of our ancestors. In this paragraph, we can immediately discern at least 4 contradictory attitudes. 1, Menchu's seeming obligation as a young woman to have children. 2, her parents' fatalism about a young Mayan woman's inability to fulfill her dreams. 3, Menchu's personal need, and 2 previous attitudes notwithstanding, to be independent and to learn and exercise her freedom. And 4, a paradoxical subordination of all of the above to the laws of Mayan ancestors. These concepts represent the symbolic array, these concerns represent the symbolic array of concepts, right? So different things are existing. There's a bunch of concepts and they exist in an array, a matrix, by which this group attempts to define itself through its culture and to differentiate itself from other primarily Western groups. We have here not the representation of a revolutionary dogma, but what Alberto Moreiras has defined as largely unconscious work on a culture to create ethnic borders through difference. The style and content of the entire narrative reinforce the hybridity of Menchu's discourse. The interpolation, that just means putting things together in conversation, of competing discourses undermines the rigidity of Western ideologies. So the fact that she's putting all these different ways of thinking together is undermining the way that Westerners, Western ideology, thinks of things. Weaving a new rhetoric of the self, building a site for performance of sly transgressive practices that push away from tutelary powers. Tutelary. So, saviorish powers, such as the Guatemalan non-Mayan revolutionary left. What Marxist revolutionary would say the following, right? So he's challenging the idea that she's a Marxist. It was about that time that my mother said she was going to learn from a chiman. That's what we call a man who tells the Indians fortunes. He's like a doctor for the Indians or like a priest. My mother said, I'm going to be a chiman and I'll learn with one of these men. And she went to the chiman and he taught her many things out of his imagination, connected with animals, with plants, with water, with the sun. My mama learned a great deal, but who knows? Perhaps that wasn't to be her role in life. Nevertheless, it helped her to learn a lot and dedicate herself to other things. My mother loved the natural world very much. The focus here on Menchu's mother in a Mayan religious context and worldview starkly contrasts with the residual racism and masculinism of the Western-looking revolutionary, whose anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist stance often disregarded ethnicized subalterns and misconceived their pre-modern past. Even so, one cannot read Menchu's text as feminist in the Western sense, even when it seems to be so, as in the following quotation. My mother used to say that through her life, through her living testimony, she tried to tell women that they too had to participate, so that when the repression comes, and with it a lot of suffering, it's not only the men who suffer. Women must join the struggle in their own way. My mother's words told them that any evolution, any change in which women had not participated would not be a change, and there would be no victory. She was as clear about this as if she were a woman with all sorts of theories and a lot of practice. My mother spoke almost no Spanish, but she spoke two languages, Quiche and a bit of Quechua. She took all that courage and all that knowledge she had and went to organize her people. Manchu's mother does not construct a feminist theoretical discourse. Rather, her life itself is a living testimony in Quiche, or Quiche as is currently spelled, or Quechua. What is more, the activism she proposes can only be understood in the context of Mayan cultural practices, since women join the struggle in their own way. Manchu may display an ingenuous certitude about her mother's innocent, a certitude about her mother's qualities, but there is no simplistic leftist or feminist rhetoric. One can also discern in Manchu's text a debt to liberation theology, a branch of the Roman Catholic Church that defended the poor and pushed for fundamental social change. Manchu's discourse borrows a great deal from the scriptures and is explained by George Lovell and Christopher Lutz and by Victor Montejo. Manchu comments, "The Bible taught me to struggle for justice. I tried to explain this to a Marxist compañera who asked me how I could pretend to fight for revolution being a Christian. I told her that the whole truth is not found in the Bible, but neither is the whole truth in Marxism, and that she had to accept that as Christians, we must also defend our faith within the revolutionary process." The relation between Catholicism and Mayan culture is a complicated one. It is well known, for example, that the conquered Mayan people, despite their apparent conversion to Christianity, continued to worship their gods in the figures of Christ and the Catholic saints. A visit to the church of Chichicastenango easily confirms that the Mayans' practice of Catholicism became a form of mimicry that only masked their cultural autonomy in a new hybrid religious context. From a purely anthropological perspective, it would be more interesting to speculate about the forms of mimicry in Manchu's text than to worry about her supposed Marxism, which itself would be no more than mimicry of the simulacrum, something similar to something pretending to be, of the Soviet ghost that many United States policymakers saw in the Central American guerrilla movements, right? So they didn't see people using ideas and forming their own new ideas. They saw just communists, the commies. That's sort of what he's alluding to here. Manchu understood herself to be a Mayan subject. She did not regard herself as just another member of the Guatemalan opposition, and she was perceived as a representative of the Mayan peoples by non-Mayan members of the opposition as well. However unsystematic her approach was, she visualized a double task: to explain Mayan culture and subjectivity, so the way you are a person, to the outside world, and to argue for its rightful place in the Guatemalan opposition. Those undertaking forced her into an inevitable duality. She had to embrace elements of Western discourse to make herself heard by her target audiences. But she also had to guarantee the preservation and continuity of her Mayan identity, which was the validating element in her discourse. So she had to keep being Mayan. This is why she performs her identity as she does, mediating Mayan secrets and Western parameters of understanding, right? So she knows how the West understands things, and she knows the ways of her people. And so she has to keep those two things mediated. And it is why she says at the end, this is the same quote that got used in the other paper, now it's translated. "Nevertheless, I'm still keeping my Indian identity a secret. I'm still keeping secret what I think no one should know. Not even anthropologists or intellectuals, no matter how many books they have, can find out all our secrets." Doris Sommer has speculated on the meaning of the trope secrets here. We may well ask whether we should not know them for ethical reasons, because our knowledge would lead to power over her community. But even if her own explicit rationale is not empirical, ethical rationale, she suggests another reason. It is the degree of our forgiveness, our cultural difference, that would make her secrets incomprehensible to the outsider. We could never know them as she does, because we would inevitably force her secrets into our framework. So is it that they can't know for ethical reasons, or that it's that they cannot understand? Manchu might be an organic intellectual in the Gramscian sense and might have more education than she admitted publicly, but she is no intellectual in the Western academic sense. Therefore, for her, Mayan identity is a fluid notion. It has to do with certain oral tradition inherited from her grandparents and parents, which corresponds more to the region in which she grew up and to the singular economic position of her family than to a truly pan-Mayan identity. The concept of identity more often than not signifies a binary opposition between the self and the other as part of a rhetorical continuum. So the concept of our identity usually has to do with us as separate from other people with which we converse or talk. As Morerias points out, this perception tends to underline difference. In Guatemala, Mayas were considered different from non-Mayas, that is, Ladinos. This view presupposed a homogeneity of Mayan identity that did not exist. All Mayas, heterogeneous amongst themselves, had in common their difference vis-a-vis Ladinos. So the only thing they had in common was that they weren't Ladinos. Themselves, not the only thing, but a thing that gets erased when we put those two terms there is that the Mayas themselves are very heterogeneous. They're different. They're not homogeneous, but they're made to be in opposition to Ladinos. Mayan identity cannot, as a result, be more than a symbolic expression to determine agency. Catholicism, Protestantism, and Mayan religion might divide Maya communities, but Mayas kept silent about their disagreements for the sake of empowerment as an ethnic group and because they saw a common denominator in the 1980s massacres, which recalled crimes from the Spanish conquest. Even for ordinary Mayas, this link was no abstraction. The relation between the events of the 16th century and those of the 1980s is clear. They are all still an open, suppurating wound. Given the symbolic nature of identity, however, the fact that Mayas are still searching for communitarian origins and a sense of collective identity, a trait among groups whose survival is threatened, combined with the absence of an established protocol to frame what it means to be Mayan, we have to read testimonios such as Menchu's as open-ended texts whose function is exploratory and tentative. They are often a first attempt to frame a rhetoric of being and to name agency for a particular subaltern group. So what is the point of testimonios such as this? To say the truth, or, well, he's saying they are often a first attempt to frame a rhetoric of being, right? A whole idea of how one is, first attempt to frame it, and to name agency for a particular subaltern group. As a result, they are allegorical by nature, or as Morera says, a testimonio is an allegory of an allegory. Their argument is framed as an ethical insistence on the right of subalterns to be themselves and thus implicitly defends cultural plurality or hybridity. Ethnicity is a language and power-driven self-awareness. So language and power-driven self-awareness makes ethnicity. The construction of ethnicity is an activity whose effects are never firmly fixed. It is never present, always represented. It is produced in a slippage, right? So it's always changing. It is constantly and simultaneously under erasure and reiterated, an irreducible dilemma of representation charged with ironic overtones, hyperbole, broken syntax. Ethnicity is constructed performatively and functions metonymically. Ethnic performativity is a function of the reiterative practice of regularity. What does the sentence say? The way you perform an ethnicity has to do with redoing practices that discursive regimes, right? So how you think of things, you're going to do things the way you know how to do things. And if the way you know how to do things is a way that controls the formation of personal and collective identity, you can only engage in those ways, right? If you don't have the language to do something different, you're always going to use the same language to do whatever it is you want to do, right? There are lines of flight in ethnicity because it is an assemblage of multiplicity of perceptions without a center or verifiable data other than its own reiteration as a truth and effect. Basically, it's living truth, right? Every moment it changes because it is maintained and kept by people and their relation to each other, right? And we don't just freeze and then we take a picture and that's what things mean. Things are constantly changing in meaning, right? That's what he's getting at. Its repetition, a sort of never-ending dress rehearsal, produces and sustains the power of the truth effect and of the discursive regime that constructed the effect and that operates in the production of racialized and ethnicized bodies. So, performing ethnicity over and over again, just doing it, being, produces and sustains the power that we believe makes it true, right? We believe that it is a thing because it is a thing. And even though it is constantly changing, the fact that it continues to be sort of similar, to be in the same idea, right? That thing creates a truth effect. We believe it to be true. And of the discursive regime, so the way that conversations happen and who gets to control them, that constructed the effect, right? So they get to say what truth feels like, and that operates in the production of racialized and ethnicized body. And they control bodies, they control people, right? You control the resources, you control the laws, you control the land, you control freedom of movement, you control bodies. Testimonio, as a written means to begin exploring the contours of a collective identity, is a concrete historical genre that evolved in Latin America during the guerrillista period, 1960 to 1990, just as it had in similar fashion in other parts of the world during specific historical events, such as the Spanish Civil War, the Algerian War, the Palestinian struggle for their homeland. Homi Bahava, among others, finds related expressions in Southeast Asia. And of course, similar texts have appeared in Africa during the continent's numerous struggles for liberation from Western powers. These imperfect, re-accented discourses carry in them a budding questioning of Western leftist thinking by virtue of their bilingual, ethnicized nature, which challenges myths of interpretive transparency and mastery. That was a sentence. Let's look at that again. These imperfect, re-accented discourses carry in them a budding question of Western leftist thinking. Okay, so we have Western leftist thinking in these conversations that are remixed, right? But they still come from the same conversations that we were having under the rule of whoever was ruling, right? Western power. So we keep having similar conversations because that's what we were left in after we were colonized. So these imperfect, re-accented discourses, these conversations that are imperfect and are now remixed, carry with them a budding questioning of Western leftist thinking. By virtue, like, why do they have this bit? Because they are bilingual, ethnicized nature, which challenges myths of interpretive transparency and mastery, right? If you are acknowledging translation, there is a part of you that has to be humble and say that you might not have captured it all. That's what they're getting at. In this context, Menchu's writing is not only the product of temporal conditions in particular locations, right? It didn't just happen in a specific time and place, but also it is a way of replacing, if not relacing, revolutionary discourse from a crypto-feminist subaltern perspective, right? This just means that it is feminist without saying so, sort of like feminists would consider that feminist, even if feminism as an ideology wasn't making it, and subaltern, right? We talked about what that means. So Menchu's writing isn't just a product of a specific time and place, but it is also trying to replace or, reimagine revolutionary discourse from a certain perspective. What is that perspective? Menchu's perspective, a crypto-feminist subaltern perspective. It undermines naive beliefs in the alleged simplicity of subaltern subjects, right? We talked about what subaltern is. Subjects, a way of being in the world, a person you can consider, right? It undermines the idea of the simplicity of subaltern subjects, right? That is a legacy of the stereotype of the noble savage, the myth. Yet at the same time, it impairs the doctrines expressed by the traditional Marxist revolutionary rhetoric. So it doesn't fall completely in line with Marxist revolutionary thought. For these reasons, although a privileged place from which to subvert Guatemalan Ladino dominant discourse, Menchu's text contains slippages that mark issues the official left has never cared to confront. So even though she was at the time that she gave it, and part of the purpose of it was to support a cause that was in alliance with something that was inspired by Marxism, her text doesn't fit fully there, right? Like, it has its own things. It is its own thing, and it has issues. It brings up things that the official left never cared to confront. However, it is inevitable that these discursive elements in her zigzagging narrative logic would create a certain degree of cultural misunderstanding. Because the Guatemalan left chooses to emphasize and identify with passages that support its ideological tenets, it does not realize that it is criticized in the text. In contrast, non-Guatemalan observers are drawn to other passages because their readings are framed by their singular ways of perceiving political issues. How we read a text has more to do with us than the text, right? The misunderstanding signaled above has led some to wonder how Menchu's voice was mediated by Elizabeth Burgos de Brey's compilation of her testimony. In an interview with David Stoll, Burgos de Brey claims that she considerably edited the transcription of Menchu's oral account. Her Spanish was very basic. She translated from her own language in her head. This is what cost me a lot. Yes, I corrected verb tenses and noun genders, as otherwise it would not have made sense, but always trying to retain her own powerful form of expression. Rigoberta's narrative was anything but chronological. It had to be put in order. I had to reorder a lot to give the text a thread, to give it a sense of life, to make it a story, so that it could reach the general public, which I did via card file, then cutting and pasting. It was hard to give it a sense of continuity in Rigoberta's own words. Stoll uses this quotation to argue that the words attributed to Menchu could not have possibly been hers. What is implicit in his observation, however, inadvertently, is that to make the text intelligible to the general public, Burgos de Brey attempted to subordinate the subaltern Mayan component, as Spivak defines it. So again, this idea of subaltern. We already talked about it. Turning the text into a hybrid Western Mayan document with clear Western legibility, right? So it has to be able to be read by the West. It is turned into a hybrid of Western Mayan content. And it is done so by Burgos de Brey, by the interviewer, the investigator, the researcher, the anthropologist. And so she subordinates a subaltern Mayan component in order to turn it into a legible text. It is as such that Menchu's story is now coming under attack. So that is the book that was published as such. That is what is the object of Stoll's analysis, right? This bit. However, Stoll contradicts his own argument when he states in subsequent interviews that he has now heard the bulk of the tapes in Burgos de Brey's possession and that they pretty much flow in the same format as the book. We've read this interview already in class. Therefore, we must ask, did Burgos de Brey change the manuscript and disguise Menchu's Mayan voice, or is the book a relatively faithful translation of the recording? In the absence of a full disclosure of the original tapes by Burgos de Brey, there is no evidence and therefore no reason to believe that the transcripts were diverged from the taped interviews. Why then does David Stoll contradict himself? What is at stake? The anthropologist as subaltern subject and truth. All right. Demanding representational accuracy in the positivist sense. Modern positivist means you believe that there is that you can know truth, sort of. Demanding representational accuracy in the positivist sense. So like you think that the truth can be known and you want it to be super accurate and you want things to represent truth as you know that they can. In the positivist sense, modern as opposed to postmodern, normative conditions have framed, formed, commodified, reified, and reiterated that which has come to be called ethnicity. Okay, so in order to say that we can represent things, that we can know truth, that we can make facts happen, we have to have this idea of ethnicity, which has to be, these things have to happen for it to keep staying around. The dominant powers regime of truth has always recognized the intellectual who interprets the subaltern subject in the name of Western accuracy. Like an investigator, going to go find out the real deal, going to put that and code that into our way of knowing a subaltern subject. But the framing isn't, we're going to incorporate them into how we understand things. The framing is, we're going to find out what's what in truth. It has been less interested in deconstructing particular strategies deployed by subaltern subjects in metropolitan or foreign spaces, or even in their attempts to frame historical data in non-Western parameters, So they're more concerned with consuming and recreating an idea of the subaltern than with actually in understanding how the subaltern work or function. It is for this reason that Manchu's discourse became stereotyped. It turned into that otherness which is the object of at once of desire and of derision, and which Baba discusses. Manchu opened up the indigenous or Native American fantasy that operates as a stereotype of phobia and of fetish for neoconservative cultural inclinations. David Stoll's book evidences the problematics of the positive assessment of testimonial, right? So positivism as a Western way of just thinking about things. So if you look at it through that lens, you get this book, and that shows the problematics of the stance. David Stoll's book evidences the problematics of the positivist assessment of testimonial in its shifts between a supposed scientific objectivity and a tendency to take sides in the complicated matter of veracity in Manchu's discourse. In his text, there is no treatment of textual absences, just a preoccupation with closed monads. See, I don't know what that means. An elementary individual substance, monad in cosmology. The concept was really conceived by Pythagoreans and may refer to a single source acting alone. Okay, so a single source acting alone. Just a preoccupation with closed monads, so with individual actors. Okay. Elements irredeemably separated from the trace of the signifier that names them. So you separate parts of its narrative, parts of the story, parts of this book from their context. His only concern seems to be verifiable truth, the tangential relationship of her testimony to her family, her life, family, and village. This is a quote from there. For this reason, Stoll ridicules the notion of collective memory and criticizes testimonial in general for not being conducive to finding a certified truth. He sees the genre a significant amount of reinvention and a lack of linear clarity. Indeed, as I explained above, testimonial is not the equivalent of sworn testimony, in which every fact has to be verified and can be classified as evidence of a crime. Stoll claims to maintain a pure view of Manchu's narrative while recognizing the myths that may lead the scientist and the public in general to misinterpret it. For example, he views the sympathy for Manchu outside Guatemala as symptomatic of "quote unquote" romancing the revolution. I Rigoberta Menchú is one of many works to win a mass audience by appealing to Western expectations about Native people. Since indígenas and peasants tend to be viewed as rustic innocents, they may have to charm their audience just to get a hearing. Anthropologists are not completely innocent in this regard, although we refute the crudest expectations. Our studies of culture and tradition have encouraged new forms of paternalism. Those romantics who idealize the claims of Native people seem to be Stoll's others here, although he suggests that anthropologists have operated under the same myths. Western anthropologists, he also admits, grant their subjects a special truth claim even while interpolating that truth according to Western symbolic systems. Western anthropologists, he also admits, grant their subjects a special truth claim even while interpolating that truth according to Western symbolic systems. So interpolating here, I think, just means interpreting. Yeah, so they interpret it. They give it an identity in the anthropology. They translate it, basically. They translate a truth to how Western people can understand it, or the Western knowledge can understand it. Stoll says he is innocent, however, uninfluenced by mythologies regarding the indigenous speaker. Yet his absolute declarations and phrases like "that alone" and his use of words like "innocent hearing" and "win" reveal that his text is more in common with the protocol of the United States judicial system than with the self-aware anthropological project that values different discursive and cultural systems. In fact, Stoll's book reveals a disdain of cultural difference, particularly in relation to Mayan concepts of time, history, and community. That is surprising in the work of an anthropologist. It also reflects a poor understanding of the social and cultural realities of the Ladino Western elite in Guatemala, where the government, the newspapers, and the judicial system work more like an obscuring Kafka's labyrinth than like the ideal enlightened image projected by their United States counterparts. So things don't work like they appear to in the US, which even there they don't work. Stoll's principal rhetoric device is to suggest a connection between Manchu and Marxism repeatedly, without ever offering conclusive proof of it. For example, he states that Cuban promotion of Rigoberta and Elizabeth's book suggested that it might be speaking for the guerrillas more than for the peasants. The internecine disputes dividing Rigoberta's neighbors dropped out of the story, making armed struggle sound like an inevitable reaction to oppression at a time when Mayas were desperate to escape the violence. Arias Manchu became a way to mobilize foreign support for the wounded, retreating insurgency. The mention of Cuba cannot be accidental. For a United States reader, Cuba is an emotionally charged trope of Soviet intervention in Latin America. By rhetorically associating Manchu with Cuba here, Stoll insinuates that she was an arms-wielding insurgent combatant, even though he seemingly focused on the use of her text after its publication. One could claim that what Stoll's text does is to expose the double blind of the colonizers' discourse regarding truth, ethnicity, culture, ideology, and politics. Indeed, I believe the book has generated so much debate because it points to unresolved contradictions in the cultural logic of the West. Ooh, here's a good juicy sentence of what he means. This is especially, I'm going to reread it. I believe, so this is the author talking about Stoll's book. I believe that the book has generated, okay, wait, now I'm not sure if he's talking about Stoll's book or Manchu's book. Stoll's test, yeah, Stoll's test. Okay. So indeed, I believe that the book has generated so much debate because it points to unresolved contradictions in the cultural logic of the West. This is so especially in regard to the predominance of left-right polemics over other types of political speech and rhetoric available to subaltern subjects in a non-Western framework. Therefore, people who aren't in this framework don't have to always be talking about left-right. They can talk about other things at the center of their politics. The controversy surrounding Stoll's book in the press and among the intellectual elite of the United States suggests that the Central American debate is still more about United States politics and paranoia than about a Mayan truth. This obsession with an imaginary Cold War perspective denies Manchu any agency outside the dynamic because it ignores political, economic, and social issues in Guatemala. It negates the possibility that Manchu's text was a strategic discourse in defense, not of leftist guerrillas per se, but of a certain sector of the Mayan people, perceived by Manchu as victims of a genocidal policy that the Guatemalan government. Manchu is certainly not making up her story, nor does Stoll ever say she is. If Manchu crafted a strategic discourse to prevent the continued genocide of her people, how can we question the authenticity of that act? Stoll uses the testimony of authentic narratives to contradict Manchu's authenticity. This textual strategy treats the subaltern subject's truth claim as intact, even while silencing the most prominent subaltern voice. Moreover, by deciding himself which of these testimonies is the authentic voice of the Mayan people, Stoll implies that the subaltern's discourse can only be validated by a white anthropologist. Thus, although he uses new tactics, he reverts to classical attitudes of his field, maintaining the hegemony of the white anthropologist while apparently giving credence to the subaltern's discourse. Stoll is right in arguing that Guatemalan history needs to be reconstructed with multiple voices, but he undercuts that project with his own text. After all, Western anthropologists have imposed their view on indigenous peoples, not respecting their truth in their own terms. Guatemalans, Mayan and non-Mayan alike, do need to reconstruct their history with multiple voices and not with a single voice or truth, but they do not need a self-chosen North American arbitrator to do so. Assuming that indigenous peoples are incapable of realizing their goals strategically outside Western paradigms, Stoll gives the following explanation of why peasants join a guerrilla organization or support insurgents. Perhaps peasants are inspired by revolutionary ideology, that is, the idea of transforming society, or perhaps they think they have something more immediate to gain, or perhaps they are pressured into cooperating with guerrillas after being swept up in a process of provocation, retaliation, and polarization that forces them to choose sides. While ethnicity is central to Manchu, nowhere does Stoll suggest an ethnic reaction against racism as a possible reason that the Mayans joined the EGP. He also does not quote Guatemalan sources that document how even well-off Mayas gave this explanation for their joining the guerrilla movement. There's some citations for that. In this sense, the situation is analogous to that of the African National Congress, ANC. Even though some of the rhetoric of the ANC had a clear Marxist content, the movement attracted even upper middle class South Africans because its primary goal was to end racism. One of the issues not yet studied in depth to this day is the abyss between an organization's official revolutionary rhetoric and the motivations of individuals who join the organization and project onto it their own phantasms and desires, which often contradict the group's rhetoric. Why does Stoll avoid the issue of racism? In Minchu's book, it is clear. She tells us, "My grandfather used to curse the Spaniards. The Spaniards were at the root of our plight. They began taking so many things out of our lands. They began stealing from us. Our ancestors' finest sons were those who were dishonored. They even raped the queens elected by our community. That's how the Ladinos came into being." To ignore such an assertion implies that ethnicity is only a trope of muddled thinking, rather than a political issue based on perspective differences among groups. Stoll's narrative seems in this sense to resist understanding, accepting and valuing modes of being right? Sorry, let me read that. Stoll's narrative seems in this sense to resist understanding, accepting and valuing modes of being that differ from those in the West. Cognizant of the impression of language and the limits of cultural understanding, most Western academics recognize that they experience less authority than in the past, though they experience greater dialogism when engaging otherness. Word mean. The use of a text of different tones or viewpoints whose interaction or contradiction is important to the text's interpretation. Oh, dialogic, okay. So it's in dialogue with other things. It's reacting, and so let's reread this with that knowledge there. Cognizant of the imposition of language and the limits on cultural understanding, most Western academics recognize that they experience less authority than in the past. So they are taken with less authority than when they were more ruling, though they experience greater dialogism when engaging otherness. So there's more going on, there's more dialogue. Writing in general is unable to capture otherness because signifiers float perpetually, deferring meaning and resisting rational interpretation in a sea of contradictions that trap any semblance of truth in semantic ambiguities or silent regions that hide the other's secrets. So when you're talking about signifiers, you're talking about language, how sort of words have different meanings for different people, and just the base difficulty of communicating in general. That trap any semblance of truth in semantic ambiguities or silent regions that hide the other's secrets. Those dark voids of reason become indefensible positions where one meaning cannot be made to coincide with another, right? So gaps between understanding and knowledge. Stoll acknowledges the impossibility of knowing the truth when he says, "Still another reason these incidents are difficult to recover is that bystanders were confused about exactly who was doing what to whom." He is also aware of the contradictions that his own discourse generates. As a result, he defends his version of events by arguing that the left wants to cover it up. In the case of the book you have in your hands, a white male anthropologist is accusing an indigenous woman of making up part of her story. The important issue is not whether she did or not. Instead, it is Western domination, which I'm obviously perpetrating. Reasoning like this enables Rigoberto's stories to be removed from the field of testable propositions to instead use as a proof text that foreigners can use to validate themselves. The subtle rhetorical shift in the last sentence, the xenophobic term foreigners, canceled out his acknowledgement of his otherness. That is his foreignness in Guatemala. The foreigners here are not anthropologists like him. They are Guatemala's leftist intellectuals who repudiate scientific methods by removing the story from the field of testable propositions and use Minchu's text for their own ends. The slippage of the term foreigners gives away his ideological bias and undermines his allegations that what he intends is a constructive critique. So this argument here, this writer here is saying the very use of the word foreigners here shows that he's not really interested in a constructive critique. He's not saying there is something I'm going to add, there's something that is I'm going to help further the ends of this text by critiquing it, right? He's saying reasoning like this, right? Thinking of the context and the implications of ethnicity and race enables this story to be, quote unquote, removed from the field of testable propositions. He wants to be able to test it, challenge it. He wants it to hold up to his scrutiny. And here he says to instead use what he's claiming is being done, uses proof text that foreigners can use to validate themselves. So who's the foreigner here? That's what he's pointing out. The slippage of the term foreigners gives away his ideological bias and undermines his allegations that what he intends is a constructive critique. Stoll divides Mayas into two groups in his work, Manchu and reliable witnesses. He complains that Manchu confuses the dates pertaining to when the army first sent troops to Uzbantan, even though he knows that when she recorded the material in January 1982, she was suffering from war trauma and had only her memory of the events that took place in her community 3 years before. He never criticizes his own reliable witnesses for their inability to remember dates. In fact, it is amusing to point out that Stoll himself, armed with historical data, confuses dates as well. For example, he transposes the dates when activists were secretly organizing in the community, 1977 to 78, with those when the army initiated repression in the area after the EGP occupied the town of Uzbandan in April 92. Elsewhere in the book, Stoll states, oh, that's the citation, 1979. Elsewhere in the book, Stoll states categorically, the date was September 9th, 1980. It should be 1979. Errors like these undermine his claim to the truth, whose declared purpose is to root out and correct the errors in another text that does not make the same type of truth claim. So he's saying that he's going to make the truth, but he makes similar errors, and the other text that he's attacking is not claiming to be truth, to be a truth claim, sort of like verifiable. Stoll's apparent belief that the interviews with other Mayan subjects are untouched by envy, fear, or greed, and the conclusions that he derives from these accounts suggest that he sees Mayas as informants in the conventional sense of positivist anthropology. So this is the second time this term comes up, and it basically means you think things can be known, but I'll read the definition here. Positivism is a philosophical theory that holds that all genuine knowledge is either positive, a posteriori and exclusively derived from experience and natural phenomena and their properties or relations, or true by definition. So either things can be proven or they can be defined. That's a philosophy, that's a theory. He never allows any voice but his to comment on and frame the meaning of the raw material that the Mayas provide. Nonetheless, the contradictions of this position become immediately obvious. Unable to offer any proof other than the credibility of his informants and his own word that such discursivity is more trustworthy than Manchu's because it is not tainted with political partisanship, he reinforces their authority with disruptive justifications like the following. Given the vagaries of memory and the translation of eyewitness accounts, Stoll does not speak any Maya language, into secondhand ones, it is hardly surprising that there are conflicting versions. Despite these elliptical permutations, doubts about concrete facts remain, and he is forced to admit it. One uncertainty is the case of San Pablo, where everyone agrees that the army attacked the village, yet no one agrees on why or how it happened, how it started, and how many were killed. Another element that deflates the illusion of totality is that the Mayan subjects speak in the midst of a community occupied by the army, where armed soldiers and intelligence assets roam freely. As a consequence, their discourses are even less objective or truthful and are more metamorphosed or metamorphized, more changed, okay? I don't know why so many language, more changed than free communication. Stoll is thus forced to admit that perhaps my sources in Tajul were too afraid of the Gualam army to acknowledge what they had witnessed. And obviously the two widows could be afraid to acknowledge what they remember. His resource is to go back to the generic witness issue as a defense. The important point of that is that her story is not the eyewitness account it purports to be. He is thus able to know more than Manchu because he never claimed to be present when the events happened, whereas according to him, she did. Stoll requires Manchu's eye to be the narrating eye, disregarding the fact that as an ethnic testimonial, her book is a communal performance and reappropriation of collective historical signs. And for Mayas, there is no clear separation between an individual subject and a community, between being and belonging. In this instance, Stoll's positioning appears to be the synecdoche of a desire for authorization in the face of cultural differentiation that makes it problematic to fix the natives' will to power. Let's try and parse that sentence out. In this instance, Stoll's positioning, so where he's coming from, appears to be the synecdoche. This is a literary term. It means that something is part of something else. So let's look at this. So you talk about one part of something to stand for the whole, right? Hopefully you guys know that from literature. to be the synecdoche of a desire for authorization in the face of cultural differentiation that makes it problematic to fix the native's will to power. The anthropologist's desire for panoptical control is thrown off balance, disquieted by the subaltern subject that dares to speak for herself. When the invisible subject claims a right to be heard in the language of the oppressor, the native's refusal to address the colonizer in his own terms is justified by the colonizer in paranoid language. As Bava and Slavojek Zizek have pointed out, can we explain, so they're just other post-colonial theories, can we explain Stoll's argument in these terms? So let's reread this bit. When the invisible subject, right, the subaltern, claims a right to be heard in the language of the oppressors, and here language isn't just referring to like Spanish or English, it's referring to like the just talking, right? The in a print, in a book, all those things. The native's refusal to address the colonizer in his own terms is justified by the colonizer in paranoid language. As Bava and Slavojek have pointed out, can we explain Stoll's argument in these terms? That is, can we say he refuses to admit he is playing the performative role of an oppressor, since he claims to make his gesture in the name of an alleged and undefined truth, whose representativeness he neither confiscates or craves? So he's not trying to have his existence justified. He's not trying to claim his humanity back or get help to resist oppression. He's trying to get at truth that he's defining and he's saying she's not participating in, basically, whose representatives he neither confiscates or craves. We know from Edward Said that certain type of cultural production by Western academics, who were products of a liberal humanist tradition that presented them as naturally superior to subaltern subjects, right? We can never get away with this. Again, post-colonialism, the legacy of colonialism. Our thought is built upon the thoughts of others, and those thoughts were coming from this superiority view, was decisive, not only in framing the historical context of colonialism, but more specifically in constructing the strategies for marginalization of ethnic subjects. So not just how we say history happened, right? History is written by the colonizers because they decided that history should be written at all, but also in how we silence and marginalize people, here specifically ethnic people, subjects. The subjectification of those individuals was in turn made possible and plausible, as Bava agrees, through the stereotypical discourse the humanist created. So humanists, the thought that comes from the West, making them into subjects, making them into people that could be, who experience the world, was made possible and plausible, so believable, through the stereotypical discourse the humanists created. What some scholars still do not realize is that when we identify with a certain political discourse, we relate to a fantasy that stages a scenario hidden behind the shifting meanings of the words. So like words change and theories change, but what we're relating to is a fantasy that stages a scenario hidden behind, how language changes, how we interpret and reinterpret things. Encoded in this fantasy is a resistance to meanings that arises from the impossibility of translating and transculturating subaltern languages into anything other than metaphorizations. So you can't know what someone who does not base their thought on the same base concepts and beliefs as the West does through translation. You can't translate that. You can't transculture it other than in a metaphor, right? You can get approximately close. You can say it's something like this, but you can't understand fully the meaning of subaltern languages because the whole knowledge basis that you're coming from is completely different than theirs. The shifting meanings prevent any categorical assertions. You can't say broad strokes. You can't assert broad things about established truths, right? So if meanings are shifting constantly, then you can't pin down truths, creating an intermediacy that provides the ground for legitimization of listening to subaltern subjects. So if you can't understand meanings because they're always changing, you have to listen to people. That is, of course, recognizing the validity of discourses that operate as symbolic expressions of agency, as tropes for the construction of identities, even if the discourses do not fit entirely in the Western conception of rationality, which we now recognize is ambiguous and indeterminate as well. So not even Western thought is pinned down because it is also changing. Tentative conclusions. Okay, we're almost done. Thank you if you're still holding on. The controversy around Manchu gives us a better understanding of the issues with which her uncanny centrality in United States cultural debate confronts us. These include the nature of testimonial literature, the need to rethink the concept of identity, and the desires and fantasies of subjective transformation, but also the identity politics that are a phantasm of hegemonic subjects' fears of disempowerment. The controversy also brings us back to the question of whether a testimonial should be read as a narration of urgency or as an unhomely fiction, as a fiction which would focus on those freak social and cultural displacements, as a fiction which relates the traumatic ambivalences of a personal psychic history to the wider disjunction of political existence. So these are another definition of testimonial, or proposals for how one should look at it. Perhaps the two salient issues of the debate are the performative nature of ethnicity as creative assemblage of the self and the problematic reading of testimonials. So what is a self if you don't come from the same belief, philosophy, looking at life? Who says, who can define what a self is? And the problematic nature of reading testimonials, right? If you don't understand the genre, if you don't read it in the genre, if you're expecting it to be like a written testimony because it looks similar, the word. If we accept the first notion as valid, then we must recognize that only bricoleurs assembling their own particular senses of ethnicity can claim any truth effect in the Foucauldian sense for their singular performativity. Don't worry about understanding this sentence. It's okay. No one else can read or decode the sets of rules by which subaltern subjects, okay? No one else can read or decode the sets of rules by which subaltern subjects operate while exercising agency by reinventing themselves as a way of restructuring their relations to power with hegemonic subjects. So different subjects, right? Subaltern and hegemonic subjects, again, it means a way of experiencing the world. You can read it as people with thoughts, agencies, perspectives. So they operate while exercising agency. How do they get their agency? Reinventing themselves as a way of restructuring the relations of power. They get more power in a place where they are denied by restructuring their relations. And how do they do that? By reinventing themselves in a way that only they can. As for the second issue, we can ask ourselves whether reading a testimonial involves the reader in a continuous act of faith, unlike that involved in literary reading, right? It's different. It is a different genre. This is a broad issue that needs to be explored further, since it leads to the question of how the reader's solidarity or political identification with the victims, dissidents, and opposition movements works when a testimonial is read. Answering this question implies a new theory of reading, given that, although Stoll argues that human rights call solely for legal discourse, they in fact demand a kind of effective empathetic reading, in which individuals who enjoy guaranteed freedoms or hegemonic positions discover and sympathize with subaltern subjects. That's like the point. It is a reading, however, that may lead to concrete political action, right? The goal of Manchu's book. Thus, reading a testimonial is radically different, not only from reading literature, but also from reading legal documents, reports of scientific data, and other such texts. For this reason, the question of how the reader of a testimonial authenticates its meaning is complex and remains unexplored. In the Manchu-Stoll debate, the indigenous subject is held up to a standard of truth that those who flaunt other discourses have never had to meet. Manchu's efforts were aimed at ending the massacre of her people at a time when indigenous peoples did not enjoy any kind of international sympathy, much less privilege. Her text and her subsequent political efforts forged a recognition of Mayan subjectivity. So again, recognition that they had a view of the world, that they were people, as well as an acceptance of the growing social, cultural, and political importance of the Mayan people. Menchú performed a role to achieve these aims, and fortunately, she has been largely successful. In her text, which did not make any historical truth claims, right, achieved the goals of ending massacre and creating respect for Mayan culture. Does it matter if it did not conform to how Western science contextualizes documentary facts? This is my question for you. All right, thank you for sticking through me. This was long, this was hard. It is okay if you didn't understand any part, although hopefully you were able to get more out of it with this reading. I do want you to look again at, well, look at this question. If you understand every part of this question and the context, that's it. That's all I want you to get out of this reading, is to understand this question that he comes to at the end and the context around it. All right. And then I would say try and reread the introduction and the conclusion again. And don't worry about understanding the whole thing. As I said, read this beginning here. And then I would also read this part, the function of testimonial, because it talks about what testimonial is for, right? Here, you can stop and then go back to the conclusion, right? Try and understand what the headings mean. Try and understand the point of the headings, even if you don't understand every bit of all the theory he goes into, because this is really dense. It does a lot, right? But those parts, the tentative conclusion, when it talks about testimonial and the introduction. And if you understand this last section, excellent. And even if you just understand this, the context and what he means with this question, like really understand it. That's all you need to get out of this text. And this is my question for you. What do you guys think? If her text, which didn't make any historical truth claims, achieved the goals of ending massacre and creating a respect for Mayan culture, doesn't matter if it doesn't conform to how the Western science contextualizes documentary facts. What do you think?